I think about what hospitals and healthcare facilities mean in place, how they are given meaning by their communities and how they shape those communities in turn. So I've just finished a research project looking at hospital closures in Scotland, and as part of that I was really interested to explore the closure of the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. It was really important that as part of constructing and using a history of the building, that was a history populated by the memories of people who worked in it and were treated in it. In a sense, hospitals of that era were total institutions. The nurses lived on site, especially for training, and sometimes for years after. Junior doctors often lived on site. There was a chapel in which members of staff could be married, so people had entire gamuts of their life played out on the hospital campus. And we heard some brilliant stories about that. So I study kind of pushback on hospital closures, and a lot of hospital closures are predicated on services centralising onto sites, often on the edge of cities. That's a really standard move for healthcare services to make in cities. And from our research, it seemed very much that the loss of the hospital, which while still felt, there's a Facebook group called Lost Edinburgh, which has lots and lots of posts, and people share old photographs of the city. And anything around the hospital will arouse, tens, sometimes hundreds of comments from people saying, oh, it's so sad that hospital was lost. So there is a sense of loss from the proximity, from the ease of being able to wander in and out of the hospital. But at the same time, it's tempered by the fact that the site had been empty for so long and looked really sad. And I think people, as much as for the clinical services, valued it as a public space, a space that was owned and felt like it belonged to Edinburgh. The fact that the quarter mile development was such a privatising development, it's a very manicured space in which behaviour is policed quite strenuously by the security team. You're not allowed to ride your bike across pedestrianised areas in quarter mile, for example, meant that while it looked beautiful, I think it felt like a continued loss to the city. So when the university bought the other half of the site, I think partly because it had been empty for so long, there was people were generally very happy about the idea that it was going to be put to a good use and cared for, rather than this kind of neglected site behind hoardings. So the Open to All is partly the fact that this was funded by voluntary contributions, the Royal Infirmary, when it was built on the Lauriston site, and felt very much like an act of care from the city for the city in that sense. That openness had a number of facets. So some of it was around the provision of healthcare, just making that available. I think about 50 years into its time on that site, the Royal Infirmary was the largest voluntary hospital in Great Britain, so even larger than the big London teaching hospitals. So a really significant institution built for the city, but significantly by the city. Anybody could access healthcare there even before the NHS. Although obviously that was extended significantly from the advent of the NHS. But people also spoke about it much more as a public space. So we heard about the fact that some of the nurses told us that the corridors at night were really scary places because anybody could come in and seek kind of warmth in the building. They talked about homeless people from the Cowgate and Grassmarket coming up to sleep on the unusually wide windowsills in the corridors. And so that openness extended beyond the provision of healthcare to a more general space, which was owned by the city and felt usable. So I think the connection with the University Medical School was probably the most significant. In fact, this is one of the oldest medical schools in the country, in the world. And so the university and the hospital really fed off each other in terms of innovation, experimentation. Also, we trained the doctors who worked there. And I think that history of scientific experimentation in Edinburgh probably gave rise to the sheer size and significance of the hospital.